Part 1. The Woman on the Porch. Florida has a strange kind of silence at night, especially deep in the woods near the lakes. The kind that makes every sound, every whisper of wind through the trees, every distant rustle, feel louder than it should. Our family vacation home sat right on the edge of that silence, an aging wooden house that had stood for over 40 years, surrounded by dense woods that felt endless. My parents loved this place, but even as a kid, something about it felt off. Maybe it was the way the trees seemed to lean inward, as if they were listening, or the way the lake, despite being so still, always seemed like it was watching. It was the summer I turned 8, and my brother Ryan was 11. We had been at the cabin for almost a week, and after days of swimming in the lake and catching fireflies at dusk, we wanted something more exciting. Our favorite game was a version of Capture the Flag, only instead of flags, we used large conch shells from the lake. That afternoon, Ryan had an idea. "Let's make the bases farther apart this time," he said, excitement lighting up his face. He pointed toward the neighboring property, a huge old house we had always assumed was abandoned. "I'll take that one." Even at 8, I felt uneasy about that place. It wasn't just the peeling paint or the overgrown lawn. It was the fact that no matter when we visited, we never saw a single car, a single light on in the windows. It was a ghost house, sitting eerily at the edge of our property, as if waiting. "Are you sure?" I asked. Ryan grinned. "No one's ever there. It'll be fun." We each ran off to build our bases. I stayed close to our cabin, stacking up small walls of snow-like piles of sand, making my fort look impenetrable. Ryan ran down the road, disappearing from sight. The rule was that once he got to his base, he'd blow the whistle to start the game. But the whistle never came. I waited. 5 minutes. 10. Still nothing. Maybe I just didn't hear it. The wind had picked up a little, rustling through the trees. I tried to convince myself Ryan had started the game already, maybe sneaking through the woods to grab my shell. But something felt wrong. I made my way down the road, stepping carefully over the roots that broke through the dirt path. The further I got, the quieter it seemed, like the whole world was holding its breath. When I reached the neighbor's yard, I expected to see Ryan's makeshift fort. It was there all right, sitting in the unkempt grass, but Ryan was nowhere in sight. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of old wood and something damp. That's when I heard it. "Are you looking for your brother?" The voice came from the front porch. I turned and saw her, an older woman standing by the door. She was smiling. Everything about that smile made my stomach twist. It was too wide, too still, like it had been painted onto her face. Something inside me screamed, "Don't move." "Your brother isn't here," she said again, tilting her head slightly. My throat felt tight. I swallowed hard, trying to form words. He was just here. Gun? The woman didn't blink. I took a cautious step forward, glancing at the house. That's when I saw it. In the upstairs window, someone was watching me. It was just a shadow at first, barely visible behind the glass. Then the figure moved, a face appearing just enough to see one eye and part of their mouth. I froze. For a split second, I thought it was Ryan, but the face was wrong. Half of it was covered by a dark beanie, and the lower half was obscured by the window frame. But the way it stared at me, it wasn't looking at me. It was waiting. A chill ran down my spine. My legs were shaking. I took another step back. That's when I noticed the footprints in the dirt leading up to the porch. They weren't mine. They weren't the woman's either. They were Ryan's. 2 sets of them. One going toward the house, and another set going back into the woods. Something inside me snapped. I turned my head back toward the forest, my breath coming fast and sharp. "Come inside," the woman said. Her voice was different now, lower, less friendly. I looked back at her, and she was still smiling. But her eyes, they weren't warm anymore. They were cold, hollow. And then I heard it. Thud. A heavy sound from inside the house. Footsteps. Coming down the stairs. I bolted. I didn't even look back. I just ran, my small feet pounding against the dirt, slipping and stumbling as I reached the road. Behind me, the woman shouted something, not at me, at someone else. I wasn't sticking around to find out who. As I ran, a familiar sound echoed through the trees. My dad's whistle. The one he used to call us home for dinner. Tears burned in my eyes as I sprinted toward the cabin. My chest ached, my lungs screaming for air, but I didn't stop. When I reached the driveway, Ryan was already there, his face pale. I skidded to a stop, breathless. "Where were you?" He looked just as shaken as me. Someone was in the house. I barely had time to register his words before my dad stepped onto the porch, frowning. "What's wrong?" We both tried talking at once. There was a woman. There was a man upstairs. My dad's face darkened. He grabbed his rifle and marched down the road. My mom pulled us inside, locking the doors behind us. We waited. When my dad came back, his face was unreadable. "Nobody was there," he said. "Doors were locked, house was empty." He cut me off with a shake of his head. A few minutes later, he made a call to our actual neighbors, the ones who owned the house. They weren't home. In fact, they hadn't been home in weeks. That night, I barely slept. Every creak of the house made me jump. Every shadow outside the window felt like someone watching. Ryan and I never played near that house again, and we never saw the woman or the figure in the window ever again. But sometimes, late at night, I wonder, if I had stepped inside that house, would I have ever come back out? Part 2, The Stranger at the Dock. There was something about the lake at night that never sat right with me. The way the water lapped against the dock in slow, heavy breaths. The way the cypress trees cast jagged shadows against the moonlight, their limbs stretching like bony fingers. The way the frogs and insects hummed in an eerie chorus, only to fall silent all at once, like they were listening. Our family's vacation home in Florida had always been a place of nostalgia, filled with childhood summers, fishing trips, and bonfires. But the older I got, the more I realized that this place was full of secrets, hidden in the dense woods, buried beneath the lake's still surface. It had been years since the incident at the abandoned house. My brother Ryan and I never spoke about that night, but we both carried the memory like an old scar. It faded, but it never really left. This time, we were in Florida for a short spring break trip. My parents were busy inside the cabin, but Ryan and I had spent most of the afternoon on the dock, watching the water. The sun had set an hour ago, and the warm glow of the cabin lights flickered from the windows behind us. I shivered, despite the humid air. Something felt off. Ryan noticed too. He leaned forward, peering into the darkness across the lake. "Did you hear that?" I strained my ears. Nothing. Just the gentle slosh of water beneath the dock. "Hear what?" Ryan hesitated, then shook his head. "I don't know. Thought I heard something moving." A ripple broke the water's surface, widening in slow, deliberate circles. A fish, probably. At least, that's what I told myself. The air had shifted, thickening with a damp, earthy scent. The usual hum of frogs and insects had died down, replaced by a low, oppressive silence. Then, from across the lake, I saw it. A figure. A dark silhouette standing at the water's edge, barely visible in the moonlight. My breath hitched. "Ryan?" He followed my gaze, his body tensing. "Do you see that?" I nodded, my pulse pounding. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, watching. "Maybe it's one of the neighbors," I whispered. But something was wrong. The closest neighbor's house was a quarter-mile away. No one ever walked through the swampy woods at night, not with the gators and snakes lurking in the shadows. Ryan stood up. "Hello?" he called. No answer. A breeze swept across the lake, carrying the faintest sound. A whisper? A breath? It was too distant to tell. Then, the figure stepped into the water. Ryan and I froze. The person waded in, slow and deliberate, the water rising to their knees, then their waist. The surface barely rippled around them. It wasn't normal. I gripped Ryan's arm. "We should go inside." He didn't argue. We backed away from the dock, moving toward the cabin, our eyes locked on the figure. Then it vanished. One moment it was there, the next, gone. A chill spread through my chest. Where did they? Before I could finish, a splash erupted from beneath the dock. Something huge moved in the water. A dark shape surged past the wooden posts, a long shadow twisting beneath the surface. I yanked Ryan's sleeve, dragging him toward the cabin. "Go!" We sprinted up the path, nearly tripping over the roots that jutted from the earth. My heart slammed against my ribs as we burst through the back door, slamming it shut behind us. Our parents looked up from the kitchen table, startled. "What's wrong?" Dad asked, setting down his drink. I opened my mouth, but the words wouldn't come. Ryan spoke instead. "There was someone in the water," he said breathlessly. "They were just standing there, watching." Dad frowned. He got up and went to the window, peering out toward the lake. The dock stretched out into the darkness, empty. "Did you see where they went?" he asked. I swallowed hard. "No. They just disappeared." He nodded slowly, then turned to Ryan. "Probably just one of the neighbors messing around." Ryan and I exchanged a glance. We both knew that wasn't true. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the occasional creaks of the old house settling. Outside, the lake was eerily quiet. No frogs, no insects, just the occasional lap of water against the shore. Then, a sound. A slow, rhythmic tap. 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 It was coming from outside. I sat up, my chest tightening. The sound wasn't random. It was deliberate, like footsteps. I turned toward the window, and there, standing on the dock, was the same figure from before. I couldn't breathe. The person stood perfectly still, their head tilted slightly to the side. I couldn't see their face in the darkness, but I knew. They were looking at me. I scrambled backward, nearly falling off the bed. My hands fumbled for my phone, but before I could turn on the flashlight, the figure took a step forward, and then another. They were walking up the dock, toward the house. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. I turned and ran. I burst into Ryan's room, shaking him awake. "Someone's on the dock," I whispered frantically. His eyes snapped open. "What?" I dragged him to the window. "Look." But when we did, the dock was empty. A cold dread settled over me. Ryan swore under his breath. "I saw them earlier. I know I did." We stayed up the rest of the night, listening, waiting, but the sound never came again. By morning, the lake was still, peaceful, like nothing had ever happened, but we both knew better. The next day, we told Dad. He sighed, rubbing his forehead. "I'll check it out." We followed him outside, keeping close as he walked toward the dock. Everything seemed normal, no footprints, no signs of anyone being there. Then Dad noticed something. Near the edge of the dock, a single, wet footprint. Too large for a child, too small for a man. Just one, pressed into the wood. Dad exhaled sharply. "If someone's messing with us, they'll regret it." He turned and walked back toward the house, but I lingered, staring at the footprint. That's when I noticed something else. The water around the dock was still rippling, as if someone had just been standing there, watching, waiting. I never went out to the lake alone again. Part 3. The knock at the window. The lake had always been strange, but after what happened the night before, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. Something had been watching us. Something had stood in the water, then on the dock, and then, somehow, vanished without a trace. The single wet footprint lingered in my mind all day. Ryan and I barely spoke about it, but I could tell he was rattled too. Our dad, trying to play the part of the skeptic, acted like it was nothing. "Probably a prank," he muttered as he locked the cabin door that evening. "Maybe some kids messing around. If I catch them, they'll regret it." But I knew better. That night, the unease returned, thicker than before. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the rhythmic creaks of the old wooden beams settling in the cold. The air was heavy with humidity, and the wind rattled the window pane. But something else was out there. I could feel it. I turned onto my side, pulling the blankets tighter around me, trying to convince myself that everything was fine. But then, knock. I froze. The sound had been faint, almost hesitant. A single, deliberate knock against the glass of my window. My throat tightened. Slowly, I turned my head toward the window. Nothing. Just the reflection of my own pale face staring back at me, eyes wide with fear. I held my breath. Maybe I had imagined it, maybe it was just the wind. And then, knock, knock, knock. This time, it was louder. My stomach twisted. The sound wasn't coming from the front door. It wasn't coming from inside the house. It was coming from outside my bedroom window. I swallowed hard, my pulse pounding in my ears. My window was on the second floor. There was no way anyone could be knocking on it. Unless they were standing on the roof, or something else was out there. I wanted to call for Ryan, but my voice was stuck in my throat. Slowly, I reached for my phone, my fingers trembling as I turned on the flashlight. I pointed it at the window. For a second, I saw nothing but darkness. Then, as the beam of light adjusted, something shifted just beyond the glass. A shadow. A face. Someone, something, was staring back at me. I couldn't make out the features clearly. The reflection of the glass distorted them, but I could see the faint outline of a grin. A slow, unnatural grin stretching far too wide. I sucked in a sharp breath, my entire body frozen in terror. Then it moved. The grin faded as the shadow pulled away from the window. A rustling sound followed, as if someone, or something, was crawling along the roof, heading toward the back of the house. I launched out of bed, bolting for the door. "Ryan," I hissed, throwing his door open. He shot up in bed, startled. "What the hell, dude?" "Someone's outside," I gasped, my chest rising and falling in quick, panicked breaths. I saw them, at my window. Ryan's expression hardened. He jumped out of bed and grabbed the baseball bat he always kept nearby. Without another word, he moved toward his own window, pulling back the curtain. I held my breath. Nothing. He turned back to me, his brows furrowed. "Are you sure?" I nodded frantically. "I swear, I saw someone. They were smiling at me." Ryan hesitated, then grabbed his phone. "I'm waking up Dad." Before he could dial, the sound of footsteps echoed from the roof above us. We both froze. The footsteps were slow, deliberate, heavy. And then, as if sensing we were listening, they stopped. They stopped. For a moment, silence pressed in around us. Then, from the direction of the living room, bang, 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 bang. The unmistakable sound of something pounding on the front door. I nearly jumped out of my skin. Ryan's face went pale. The pounding came again, rattling the door in its frame. "Who the hell?" Ryan whispered. I shook my head. "Don't answer it." Another bang, louder this time, more impatient. A voice followed, low, muffled. "Let me in." I felt like I couldn't breathe. The voice was wrong. It wasn't deep or angry. It wasn't panicked like someone in trouble. It was calm. Too calm. Like whoever was speaking already knew we weren't going to open the door. Ryan motioned for me to stay put, then crept toward the stairs. Against my better judgment, I followed. We peered over the railing, down into the dimly lit living room. The front door stood firm, the deadbolt locked. But through the small frosted window at the top of the door, a shadow. Someone was standing just outside, still, waiting. I felt like I was going to be sick. Ryan gripped the bat tighter. "Dad," he whispered, his voice hoarse. Before he could wake him, the shadow outside shifted. Then, the doorknob started to turn. I let out a strangled breath. The lock held, but the knob jiggled over and over, as if whoever was outside was testing it. Then, silence. Ryan and I stood frozen, our hearts hammering. 1 second. 2. 3. Then, Footsteps, slow and deliberate, circling the house. Whoever was out there wasn't leaving. They were checking the windows. I grabbed Ryan's arm, my entire body trembling. "We have to wake Dad." This time, he didn't argue. We bolted down the hall, throwing open our parents' door. "Dad, wake up." He sat up with a start, rubbing his eyes. "What?" "There's someone outside," Ryan whispered harshly. Dad's face darkened. He was up in an instant, grabbing the flashlight from his nightstand and moving toward the front door. We followed closely behind, our breaths held as he peered out through the peephole. For a moment he was silent. Then he muttered a curse. "What?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Dad took a deep breath, then opened the door. Just a crack. I sucked in a breath. The porch was empty. The night stretched out before us, still and silent. No footsteps, no shadows. Nothing. Dad stepped onto the porch, shining the flashlight toward the dock. The beam of light danced across the wooden planks, illuminating the empty shoreline. I shuddered. Whoever had been out there, they were gone. Dad turned back to us, his expression unreadable. "You're sure you saw someone?" Ryan and I exchanged a look. "We heard them," Ryan said. "They were knocking, checking the windows." Dad exhaled through his nose, rubbing his temples. "All right, everyone inside. Now." We obeyed without question. Dad locked the door, double-checking every window before finally grabbing his shotgun from the closet. He didn't say much after that, just told us to stay inside and lock our doors. I barely slept. The next morning, Dad walked the perimeter of the house. No footprints, no sign of forced entry. Just the same, quiet stillness, as if nothing had happened at all. But we knew better. That night, we left the lake house early, and we never, ever went back.